Hey everyone, and welcome back to Stellar HFY, your home for strategic sci-fi that makes you question who's really in control. First off, thank you. Seriously, your support, your comments, your theories, they've taken this channel further than we ever expected. Today's story is about an alien empire surrounds our colonies with perfect fleets. They believe in math, prediction, control. But what happens when humanity builds something they can't anticipate? So without any delay, let's begin. The Kepler expanse was never meant to be a battlefield. It was a buffer, an arc of resource-rich systems, scattered mining stations, and half-terraformed colonies caught between the civilized edge of Terran space and the silence that preceded the Ziran Dominion. That silence ended 12 days ago. The Zirans didn't announce themselves with declarations or warnings. They arrived in formation, grid-aligned phalanxes of angular warships that moved like synchronized code. One moment the expanse was a network of civilian outposts and defense satellites. The next, it was a quarantine zone. Communications failed. Patrol beacons vanished. When Terran Command rerouted recon satellites to the sector, they saw them, hundreds of vessels perfectly still in vacuum, covering the approaches like a wall made from engineered intent. And behind them, nothing moved. Nothing needed to. Footage from civilian transmitters made it out before the relays were blacked. No screaming, no firestorms, just empty landing zones, scattered tools, mining rigs half running until power reserves bled dry. Outposts on Lenkar 4, Polari Reach, and Newton's Gate went dark in sequence. People didn't even have time to flee. The Ziran doctrine wasn't extermination, it was replacement. Their fleets didn't burn cities, they unplugged them. Then they rebuilt everything without the people. In the reinforced war room of Earth's Outer Defense Command, Commander Reese Marvick stood at the center table, surrounded by cold light projections of the collapse. He didn't speak during the replay. He didn't flinch at the casualty counts. He simply watched, jaw locked, as every Terran maneuver failed in perfect symmetry. Marvick wasn't a tactician by title. He was a systems thinker. Before his elevation to military command, he'd been an operations analyst for orbital logistics, working in scenarios that didn't involve weapons, but systems, timing, chaos. That's what made him dangerous. He didn't believe in grand gestures or glory formations. He believed in pressure points. What he saw in the Dominion's blockade was not just power, it was a system too efficient to be organic. The Dominion relied on predictive combat doctrine, optimized AI command systems, and an assumption of mirrored behavior. In simulation, their fleet formations could neutralize anything that followed expected tactical responses, and humanity so far had done exactly that. Terran destroyers opened with standard flanking spirals, frigates formed spearhead breaches, attempting mass torpedo runs. The Zirans responded as anticipated, intercepted, isolated, eliminated. No losses on their side, minimal variance. The last three Terran squadrons had gone in with discipline, precision, and bravery. It didn't matter. They were erased like replicated input in a solved equation. Marvick stepped back from the table and looked to the suspended model of the expanse. The enemy wasn't reacting. They were dictating. Everything Terran Command did, they were already prepared for. Every battle was already accounted for before it began. The Dominion didn't improvise. They didn't guess. They calculated. And their calculations worked because Earth was still trying to fight them like this was a fair contest. He walked slowly to the adjacent operations board. Two aides stepped aside instinctively. His fingers moved across the interface, not with urgency, but with finality. He closed every projection of standardized combat models, shut down every command proposal based on symmetrical engagement, deleted every fleet maneuver that had ever been recorded in Earth's naval wargame database. He stared at the darkened display, blank, unscripted. Then he issued a single clear command. Turn off the playbook. That order didn't ripple through the command structure immediately. It crashed. Some officers resisted. Others stared in silence, confused. But Marvick didn't explain. He simply marked every frontal engagement proposal as invalid and locked fleet assignments until further notice. Instead of prepping for another wave, he directed resources to intel, stealth asset reallocation, and narrowband sensor sweeps. For the first time since the expanse collapsed, Earth's defense doctrine went quiet, not in fear, but in redirection. He refused to waste another crew on a frontal death march. He wasn't going to outmatch the Dominion's wall. He was going to make them question why the wall had been built in the first place. And for the first time, the Dominion wouldn't be reading a pattern. They'd be staring into absence. Reese Marvick stepped back into his quarters hours later. The lights dimmed low by default. He didn't sit. He didn't rest. He simply stood at the window, watching the stars not for what was there, but for what he'd make the enemy believe was there. They thought they understood humans. That was their first mistake. The first raid struck at 0310 hours local Kepler standard. 3 Terran stealth frigates pierced the Dominion's outer relay perimeter near Lenkar Drift, targeting a Ziran logistics arc composed of fuel carriers and encrypted signal nodes. The approach vector was curved through a debris field seeded months earlier, trash rock and ice from old asteroid mining ops that masked their thermal signature just long enough. The moment the frigates were in range, they unleashed focused EM bursts tuned to overload Ziran relay buffer timing. The signal loops folded back on themselves, and for 4 minutes, the nearest Dominion command nodes received nothing but their own past orders. Then came the secondary payloads, smart charges that ruptured the underhull fuel pods of the lead tanker and sent the entire supply lane cascading into its own escape trajectory. By the time Ziran patrol units arrived, the Terran ships had already vanished into dark drift. Marvick didn't celebrate. He didn't debrief the crews personally. He gave no public commendations. The raid wasn't a victory. It was a test run. What mattered wasn't how many Dominion tankers burned. What mattered was how long it took for their escort protocols to reassign. The answer came 12 hours later. One patrol group detached from the forward grid near Polari Reach and doubled back to secure the midline. That was the fracture point he was waiting for. He had his analysts comb the Dominion's response pattern frame by frame. Ziran fleets didn't improvise. They adapted within strict confidence intervals. If the enemy bled resources, they didn't reinforce. They reorganized. That made them vulnerable not to firepower, but to misdirection. Marvick began feeding them targets that didn't exist. The next wave wasn't about damage. It was about noise. Terran scout craft launched with mission orders not to engage, but to emit false signals. Every burn, every energy ping, every relay bounce was designed to resemble a larger formation. Each pattern mimicked what a Dominion algorithm would recognize as a real Terran assault wing. Some ran hot for only 20 seconds. Others looped misaligned formations that would make sense only to an enemy trying to predict intent. The Dominion chased all of them. Across the expanse, Ziran ships began rerouting. Fuel consumption doubled in some sectors as intercept paths became inefficient. Entire nodes of the wall were thinned to fill gaps that didn't need filling. And while those adjustments were made, the real Terran operations slipped between the seams. Marvick's command teams coordinated simultaneous pinprick strikes on Dominion staging buoys, hitting unprotected sensor masts or pulse relays. They didn't destroy much. They just made the Zirans feel incomplete. But the price was measured in lives. Stealth was never perfect. Dominion ships operated with redundancy and overlapping coverage. If a Terran craft misjudged timing, its heat flare could trip an entire quadrant's alert net. The Dominion didn't scramble. They executed. 4 stealth corvettes were lost in the first week alone. Their transponders were programmed to go dead on contact. No data returned, just silence. The crews didn't panic, not outwardly, but the tension spread. Pilots knew they were ghosts now. Weaponized illusions sent to bait an enemy that couldn't be stunned, only tricked. It wore on them. They started asking questions in the ready bays. Not the kind you file, the kind that start with how much longer and end with are we actually winning or just buying time for the collapse to be prettier. In one of the secondary drone bays, Terran engineers began modifying interference payloads. The first working prototype deployed quantum noise fields that scrambled Dominion targeting sinks for a fraction of a second. Barely a hiccup, but enough to make an intercept miss by meters or delay a shield calibrator by half a cycle. These weren't offensive weapons. They were irritants. It was death by calibration error. Marvick pushed them into the next ops cycle with no media release, no internal notice, just action. The drones were dropped mid-combat, disguised as debris from fake engagements. The results were quiet. But when Dominion corvettes began missing clean shots or overcorrecting shield angles, Marvick saw the shift. Their confidence wavered, not because of firepower, but because the equations they trusted were now returning bad answers. He still didn't call it success. He called it drift. Because despite the gains, the body count rose. Every misdirection required bait. Every illusion required someone to play the shadow. And shadows burned out fast. But the proof came near Polari Verge. A standard Phantom op, 3 stealth frigates broadcasting a misaligned formation pattern, was scheduled to trigger a moderate escort deployment. Instead, the Dominion overreacted. They pulled an entire reserve wing from the central grid and sent it spiraling into the Verge corridor at full burn. For the first time since the blockade formed, a Dominion line formation broke cohesion. Marvick stood in the primary operations tier, watching the sensor returns in silence. The grid analysis confirmed it, a full 12% coverage collapse across the Verge. He gave the order immediately. A half-dozen Terran corvettes launched into the gap, struck 2 unshielded relay satellites, and dropped sensor denial charges that blinded Ziran re-entry paths for hours. One Dominion patrol turned back before entering the zone, first recorded retreat since the war began. Marvick said nothing. He just nodded once and left the deck. They were bleeding time from the stone, not because Earth was stronger, but because they'd made the Dominion doubt its own rhythm. And that, Marvick knew, was the first real weapon. The ship wasn't on any registry. Not even the black-layered fleet manifest that required triple authentication keys and retinal scans. It had no hull number, no formal designation, no berth at any known orbital yard. It was built in slices, one frame segment on Europa, a core chamber floated inside the lunar shade, propulsion modules tested as research components inside asteroid shadow zones. Then it was all brought together, not in dry dock, but in silence, assembled deep within the twisted rock fields of Kepler 91, where the debris belt had never been mapped, only avoided. The ship would never win a battle by force. It wasn't meant to. It was designed to rewrite the definition of engagement itself. Vanguard 1 had no central bridge. It didn't need one. It had a core, a sealed compartment of neurosynaptic lattice coils, computational dampers, and what Dr. Halric Voss called a chaos clutch. Voss had designed neural architectures before, mostly for civilian-grade adaptive systems, but nothing like this. Nothing that intentionally introduced random drift into command logic. Vanguard's AI wasn't built for precision. It was built to disrupt precision. Every second, it generated thousands of micropath predictions, then discarded the ones that seemed too orderly. Voss called it intuition modeling. Marvick just called it necessary. The Ziran fleet ran on certainty. Vanguard would become its poison. Voss had argued for months during development that chaos wasn't enough. It had to be guided chaos, something between probability and instinct. So Vanguard's interface loop included a live human node, meaning every operation would pass through a trained operator, never to correct the AI, but to bias it. They weren't trying to make the ship smarter than Dominion logic. They were trying to make it stranger. When the final ignition test lit in the asteroid belt, there was no sound. Only a ripple through the void as Vanguard 1 rotated from drift to directional thrust, its outer hull flickering as embedded phase plates absorbed and reshaped sensor noise. To the Zirans, the ship would appear as heat residue one moment, gravitational shadow the next. It never held shape, never held signal. It didn't just hide, it misrepresented. Inside, Marvick stood with Voss and Lieutenant Darren Rusk in the neural interface bay. They didn't speak during the first simulation run. Vanguard was fed a combat scenario, a small Terran fleet crossing through a Dominion detection arc. The AI projected a defense pattern, then inverted it, then scattered false telemetry across 3 vectors. Dominion intercept ships in the sim began repositioning toward phantom zones, while the actual fleet passed undetected. The second test was more aggressive. Generate the appearance of a full Terran Armada forming near Lenkar Drift. Vanguard pulsed feedback signatures that perfectly mimic ship movements, cross signals, and navigation pathing. Dominion analysis models flagged the contact as high priority. Response time in the simulation? 6 minutes. Vanguard's real trace never registered. It hadn't masked itself. It had convinced the enemy to look elsewhere. Voss turned from the display with a look that wasn't pride. It was the look of someone watching something he no longer fully controlled, but knew had to exist. From that point forward, Vanguard 1 became the centerpiece. Marvick shifted the operation structure, giving Vanguard full authority over spatial positioning, signal warfare, and engagement misdirection. Traditional command remained with fleet-wide defense. Vanguard's job was to rewire the Abreuer enemy's perception to make every Terran movement feel misaligned, unpredictable, and deeply wrong. If the Zirans doubted their sensors, they'd hesitate. And hesitation, in a war of timing, was fatal. The operation they devised wasn't subtle. Marvick called it bait and collapse. Rusk would lead decoy units, real ships with real pilots, but tasked not with assault, but with broadcasting false scale. Each ship would emit chatter suggesting a larger formation. Off-pattern comm bursts, navigational lags, poorly veiled heat trails. It would look like a mistake. It wasn't. Vanguard would run in parallel, reshaping those signals into full fleet emulation. To Ziran command, it would look like Earth had redeployed half its force to Kepler 91. The key wasn't the lie. It was how plausible the lie looked. The Zirans would believe it because it would match what their AI expected from a desperate human fleet. Disorganized strength, telegraph movement, overreaching with numbers they didn't have. And as they repositioned their prime formation to intercept, they'd unknowingly walk into a narrow orbital lane preset for triangulated fire, where real Terran cruisers, hidden by Vanguard's distortion field, waited with heavy magnetic breachers aimed straight at their command line. There were risks. If the Zirans hesitated, they might detect the lack of mass in the decoys. If their fleet-wide AI recalibrated mid-strike, the trap would collapse before it closed. Marvick approved it anyway, because the final piece wasn't tactical, it was psychological. On the day of deployment, Vanguard 1 came online in full spectrum. Its core array rotated up to phase alignment and broadcast a short burst into the Ziran combat grid. Not in human code, not in translation. It used their encryption, uncracked, flawless. It spoke to them in their own military language. That signal only lasted half a second, then disappeared. But in that half second, Ziran AI protocols registered one impossible truth. Earth had penetrated their combat net, and something Terran was already inside, watching, learning, shaping. The panic didn't show in explosions or shouts. It showed in adjustments, ships rerouting to unmarked zones, priority packets sent to Dominion high orbit without context, and delays in their next response window. Small cracks, but cracks in the most rigid system the galaxy had ever built. Marvick stood in Vanguard's observation shell, staring at the ships that didn't know they'd already started to lose. Now they would have to guess. And humans, he knew, never fought fair when guessing was involved. The signal distortions began as murmurs, barely enough to trip Dominion early warning protocols. Isolated gravitational anomalies, faint emissions on low-band Terran frequencies, whispered comm loops too sloppy to be authentic. But the frequency of these irregularities increased over the span of 2 days, and by the third, the simulation maps constructed by Ziran Fleet AI began to form a conclusion. Human reinforcements had arrived, not one group, multiple, dispersed, disorganized, but massing in the Kepler 91 approach corridor. To Ziran Admiral Varen Sol, it looked like desperation, the kind he understood. From orbit above the captured Polari Reach station, Sol oversaw his formation of 83 primary warships and 72 auxiliary carriers, all positioned in perfect symmetry, until now. He ordered 60% of the formation to prepare for acceleration and engagement. The models were clear. This was Earth's last consolidated push, a final fleet surge through the corridor. Predictable, foolish, the perfect opportunity to finish the campaign in a single decisive strike. What Sol did not know, what no Ziran system could fully model, was that the Terran cruisers transmitting those patterns were not trying to hide. They were trying to be seen. Lieutenant Darren Rusk led the decoy squadron through the outer edge of the corridor, skimming the thermal eddies off Kepler 91's asteroids. His orders were clear: transmit misaligned fleet chatter. Not encryption locked, not clean, just enough signal leakage to imply coordination and urgency. His ships flew loose formations, staggered at odd intervals, turning early and late, banking hard on long approaches to make their numbers look bloated in sensor echo. They even fired once at nothing. It was recorded and flagged by Ziran drones as proof of incomplete command cohesion. By the time Ziran long-range scouts confirmed the signatures, Sol's confidence had turned to certainty. He gave the order. The Dominion formation launched into the corridor in 3 wings, accelerating along routes tailored for suppression fire and envelopment. But what they entered wasn't a battlefield. It was a design. Vanguard 1 activated the first interference burst the moment the Ziran forward elements crossed the halfway mark. The pulse wasn't intended to jam, it was meant to confuse. It transmitted Dominion combat identifiers in rapid succession, overlaying them across friend-foe protocols on Ziran ships. For 1.2 seconds, every subunit received a clash of ident tags. Enough to delay lock-on targeting, enough to force a system pause, enough to fracture tempo. The second pulse came moments later. Vanguard projected false acceleration trails along the flanks of the corridor, making it appear as if Terran warships were preparing to break through from both sides. The Zirans responded accordingly, by rotating defensive emplacements and shifting fire arcs. That's when Marvick struck. From within the debris shadows lining the corridor, hidden behind ejected asteroid clusters and radiation-dead mining platforms, 32 Terran vessels powered up simultaneously. They weren't stealth ships. They didn't need to be. They had been silent, powered down, cold positioned for days under Vanguard's cloaking influence. Now they surged to life. The first volley came from 3 angles, not at the lead Ziran ships, but at their rear communication nodes. Breacher torpedoes overloaded signal relays before frontline command could coordinate a response. The Ziran formation fragmented not from damage, but from doubt. Targeting data failed to sync. Command order buffers returned null. Admiral Sol's personal carrier issued a proximity lock on what it believed was an encroaching Terran ship, only to realize too late it was one of his own auxiliary wings broadcasting corrupted IFF. The lock was aborted, but the pause caused a ripple. Nearby cruisers began to hesitate. Shield deployments triggered in conflict. Fire arcs crossed in error. 2 Ziran gunships activated defensive bursts into friendly sectors and were subsequently disabled by their own protocols. Within minutes, the corridor was no longer a lane of advance. It was a sealed box. The Terran flanks closed with disciplined fire, not in pursuit, but in precision. They didn't chase ships. They disabled maneuvering engines. They didn't destroy carriers. They shattered their signal masts. Marvick had given clear orders. No annihilation, no glory. This wasn't a show of force. This was control. Vanguard 1 maintained the illusion the entire time. Even as real Terran ships tore through the corridor's pressure points, Vanguard continued broadcasting phantom wings on the far end of the sector. Dominion Command believed Earth had deployed double its actual fleet count. They began recalculating the risk. Admiral Sol watched in disbelief as his own formations failed to regain cohesion. The Terrans hadn't overwhelmed them. They had removed their confidence. Every ship under his command was now surrounded by doubt. Doubt about signals, ident tags, the legitimacy of incoming fire orders. His fleet had trained for power parity, not for narrative collapse. By the time the Dominion tried to reverse course, it was too late. The corridor was saturated with sensor-conflicting debris, jamming mines and active Terran positioning. No straight line remained. Every retreat path looked suspect. They were not destroyed. They were not defeated. They were trapped. And none of them knew how many enemies they were actually facing. Because by the end of the engagement, Vanguard 1 wasn't just distorting space, it was distorting reality. The Dominion flagship, Heraxis Prime, was a fortress wrapped in logic. 4 command decks, 3 independent AI cores, and redundant fleet line links that pulsed in perfect synchronicity with every warship across the sector. It never deviated, never stuttered. Its systems were immune to deception. At least, that's what the Zirans believed. From orbit, it resembled a geometry problem given mass. Long, angular vectors flowing outward from a central ring, pulsing with the same controlled rhythm that defined the entire Ziran doctrine. In their war model, Haraxis Prime was the constant. Everything else adapted around it. Vanguard. One's override sequence began with a whisper, one packet, one protocol, a shallow echo that inserted itself into Haraxis's tactical comms as a friendly query. The ship's firewall accepted it as routine traffic. The second signal arrived milliseconds later, coded as a diagnostics request from a verified fleet ship. The third faked a navigation timestamp from the flagship's own backup routing system. It wasn't just intrusion, it was replication. Vanguard 1 didn't break through the Dominion systems, it became them. Within 6 seconds, the flagship's entire command relay returned junk data. No alerts were triggered. Instead, all subunits received confirmation that fleet cohesion was stable, enemy vectors unchanged. And so no one noticed that Haraxis Prime had gone completely blind. Inside Dominion formation walls, panic didn't come in screams. It came in silence. Auxiliary cruisers began requesting updated orders. Frigate units rotated position and received no confirmation. The Ziran battle AI, normally cold and calculating, began rejecting internal inconsistencies at an escalating rate. Ships began pinging each other to verify fleet geometry. Some received pings from units they couldn't locate. Others reported being mirrored, phantom ships occupying their exact coordinates on secondary mapping overlays. The formation began to eat itself. Terran forces didn't press the advantage with force. They advanced in patterns of surgical intent. Precision fire from cold-locked cruisers stripped the antenna arrays from key Dominion carriers. Ion scatterbursts disabled propulsion grids without breaching hulls. Every move was designed to unbalance, not annihilate. Marvick had ordered no glory passes, no clean kills. He wanted the Dominion to see what was happening to them, and more importantly, he wanted them to doubt what they saw. As Ziran units flailed for command structure, their most sacred constant, the flagship, floated silently, unaware, its lights flickering with looped input. Internal crew were isolated from external feedback, forced to navigate by partial HUDs and corrupted motion data. Control stations began contradicting each other. Rear gunners received forward lock data. Starboard shielding attempted to counter non-existent threats. Then the main viewport screen on Haraxis Prime turned black. A moment later, it lit with one impossible image. A Terran flag, projected not over the ship. From it, embedded into its external surface via directed projection arrays, spliced into the hull just seconds before, the flag shimmered across the curve of the Dominion's most sacred command ship, crimson, black, and gray, swaying slightly as if in atmosphere. Not animated, not decorative, declarative. Marvick gave the stand-down signal. The entire Terran assault line halted. Drives cooled, weapons powered down. For 90 seconds, not a single shot was fired. Terran cruisers remained motionless in coordinated formation, shadowed by Vanguard 1 above them, silent, untouchable, steady. The Dominion had trained for kinetic dominance. They had trained to counter strength with precision. They had never trained for psychological silence. Across Dominion ranks, sub-commanders stared at sensor feeds and returned no orders. With their flagship dark, their logic chains broken, and the enemy not pressing forward, they could no longer trust what they saw. Some attempted reboot protocols, others initiated manual override. Nothing changed. Every attempt to establish central hierarchy failed. A carrier near the corridor's edge attempted to fire a probing shot. A single rail slug fired into the void. Within milliseconds, it was locked by 9 separate Terran units, not fired upon, just tracked. Their targeting lasers hit the hull like warning touches. The Dominion vessel immediately ceased fire and powered down weapons. In the vacuum between both fleets, nothing moved. Not a ripple, not a trace, just hundreds of Ziran vessels suspended in a state of doubt, flanked by human forces that had turned silence into a weapon. On the upper deck of Vanguard 1, Marvick didn't speak. He stood behind the interface node while Vanguard's AI fed him real-time probabilities. None of it mattered now. He had no need for analytics. This was no longer a battle. It was the moment of machine empire. one that believed in the supremacy of modeled behavior, realized it could no longer trust the models. He ordered all Terran units to hold position, not in defense, not in challenge, in stillness. The message was clear. We could destroy you, but we don't need to. Let that echo. From orbit, the final image was captured. Vanguard 1, center top, casting a long shadow over the corridor's battlefield. Beneath it, the Terran fleet in 3 clean arcs. Opposite them, the Dominion wall, fractured, halted, unmoving. And at its heart, the Haraxis Prime adrift, silent, and bearing a flag not its own. The Dominion transmission came through unencrypted. No encryption was needed. It was brief. 12 seconds of fleet standard Ziran syntax routed across all known tactical bands. No threat signatures accompanied it. No escort traffic followed. The message carried no surrender terms, no delegation notices, and no ceremonial language. It simply stated that all Ziran offensive operations in the Kepler sector would be suspended indefinitely. In the history of their expansionist regime, nothing like it had ever been broadcast. Earth's unified command convened immediately in layered quorum. Half the Admiralty wanted to push. Their logic was clean. Strike now, with the Dominion fractured, and reclaim every outpost lost across the expanse. Deploy follow-on fleets. Push them to the next line. Make them regret ever testing the edge of Terran space. But Marvick wasn't at the table for applause. He'd seen the Dominion's fear firsthand, not as a resource to exploit, but as proof of something deeper. They didn't fear Terran firepower. They feared their own uncertainty. Pressing the advantage, he warned, would not reinforce victory. It would erase the doubt. And doubt, not destruction, was the only weapon that had ever truly worked. In the end, his counsel held. The ceasefire stood. Across the expanse, Dominion ships slowly retracted. Not in haste, not in shame, but with precise, measured course corrections. Shapes in retreat, maintaining dignity even in collapse. Terran vessels did not follow. Not one shot was fired in response. When the Dominion fleet passed beyond Kepler 91, no beacon was lit. No declaration was read. Earth simply closed the book and shelved it. Vanguard 1 was not paraded. No broadcast celebration named it the savior of the colonies. It was quietly repositioned to an outer observational shell above Kepler 91, embedded into the region's long-range sensor grid. It would not command again, it would not interfere. It would watch. A monument, not of war, but of method. In private chambers, some debated whether it should have been disassembled, lest others try to copy its doctrine. But Marvick gave a quiet objection. The ship didn't win because it was powerful. It won because it refused to obey the rules. That wasn't a weapon. That was a mindset. And anyone who tried to reproduce it without understanding that would never succeed. In the weeks that followed, the image circled every human network. The Terran flag softly projected across the dormant hull of Haraxis Prime. It became more than propaganda. It became a reckoning, not because it showed conquest, because it showed restraint. Children in Lagrange habitats drew it on alloy plates. Veterans on Luna's shadowside outposts gathered in silence as the image streamed overhead. For many, it was the first moment in years they exhaled without counting the cost. On a rain-washed night above Earth's northern hemisphere, Reese Marvick sat alone in a recording room no wider than a corridor. The walls bore no emblems. The lights cast no shadow. He wore no dress uniform. The interface screen blinked silently, waiting. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the metal edge of the desk, voice quiet but steady. He didn't mention the names of lost ships. He didn't describe the enemy. He didn't invoke history. He just said this. No one remembers who shot first. They'll remember who made them stop. He ended the recording, and the war was over. If this story gave you chills, hit that subscribe button and join us here at Stellar HFY, where humanity doesn't just fight, it outthinks the galaxy. Now we want to hear from you. If you had command of Vanguard 1 for just one mission, what strategy would you use to dismantle an empire without firing a shot? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every single one. Thanks for watching Stellar HFY, where silence becomes the deadliest signal, and wars are won before they're even noticed. See you in the next story.